John F. Kennedy and the Weight of a Young Presidency. John F. Kennedy entered the White House carrying a weight rarely placed upon someone so young. At just 43 years old, he became the youngest elected president in American history, stepping into an office shaped by global tension, nuclear fear, and quiet uncertainty. The title of president carried authority, but the responsibility behind it was constant, invisible, and deeply personal. In the early days of his presidency, the Oval Office felt less like a throne and more like a listening room. Reports arrived each morning detailing crises unfolding across oceans. Advisors spoke in measured tones, aware that every word might influence decisions with irreversible consequences. Kennedy listened carefully, often pausing before speaking, understanding that haste could be as dangerous as hesitation. Youth gave him energy and vision, but it also drew skepticism. Allies wondered if experience could be learned quickly enough. Adversaries tested limits, probing for weakness. At home, Americans looked to him for reassurance during a time when the future felt fragile. Behind the confident speeches was a man aware of history's gaze, conscious that each choice might echo for generations. Kennedy relied heavily on discussion and reason. He welcomed disagreement, believing that leadership required humility as much as strength. The weight he carried was not only the power to act, but the restraint to pause, to reflect, and sometimes to choose the least dramatic path. As nights grew quiet and the city slept, the presidency remained awake. In those moments of solitude, John F. Kennedy carried the nation's hopes and fears with calm resolve. His presidency was brief, but the burden he bore shaped an era, reminding the world that leadership is often heaviest when carried quietly. A president born into privilege and expectation. John F. Kennedy was born into a world of advantage, but privilege arrived hand in hand with expectation. From the beginning, his life was shaped not only by wealth and opportunity, but by a powerful family belief that public service was a duty, not a choice. The Kennedy household was competitive, disciplined, and forward-looking, with success measured not in comfort, but in achievement. Growing up, John was often underestimated. He was physically fragile, frequently ill, and quieter than his older brother, Joseph, who was widely seen as the family's future political star. Yet beneath this calm exterior, Kennedy developed an observant mind and a reflective nature. Illness slowed his body, but sharpened his awareness. Long periods of rest became moments of reading, thought, and quiet ambition. Expectation followed him everywhere. Teachers, friends, and family all assumed greatness lay ahead, even when the path was unclear. Privilege opened doors, but also removed excuses. Failure was never meant to be permanent. Every achievement carried the unspoken pressure to honor the Kennedy name and extend its influence. World events soon shaped that pressure into purpose. War, global conflict, and shifting power structures revealed that leadership demanded more than confidence. It required judgment, restraint, and empathy. Kennedy absorbed these lessons slowly, understanding that preparation mattered more than displayed. By the time he entered politics, he carried both inheritance and intention. Privilege had given him access, but expectation gave him direction. His rise was not effortless nor accidental. It was shaped by a lifelong awareness that his life was meant to serve something larger than himself. In quiet moments, John F. Kennedy carried this weight calmly. Privilege had placed him near power, but expectation taught him how seriously it must be held. Early life in Massachusetts and the making of character. John F. Kennedy's character was shaped long before he entered public life in the quiet rhythms of his early years in Massachusetts. Surrounded by family, tradition, and constant movement, his childhood unfolded between schoolrooms, summer homes, and long conversations filled with ambition and expectation. Yet beneath this active surface was a boy learning to observe more than he spoke. Kennedy's early life was marked by contrast. He grew up with comfort and opportunity, but his health was fragile. Frequent illness kept him apart from others, forcing moments of stillness into an otherwise busy household. These pauses became formative. While confined indoors, he read widely, developing curiosity and a habit of reflection that would remain with him throughout life. Massachusetts offered more than geography. It provided a sense of history, civic duty, and public engagement. Stories of politics, war, and leadership were common topics at home. Kennedy absorbed these ideas quietly, learning that leadership was not abstract, but personal and demanding. Responsibility, he learned, belonged to those willing to carry it. Competition within the family sharpened his resolve. Surrounded by strong personalities, he learned resilience and patience. Rather than seeking attention, he learned timing. Rather than force, he learned persuasion. These early lessons in balance and restraint shaped the way he would later lead. As the years passed, the environment of his youth left a lasting imprint. Massachusetts gave Kennedy a sense of place and purpose, while his experiences gave him depth beyond his age. In those early years, the foundation of his character was laid quietly, shaped by illness, observation, and a growing awareness that his life would one day move in the public eye. War, survival, and the PT 109 experience. The defining test of John F. Kennedy's early adulthood came not in politics, but in the quiet danger of war. During World War II, far from public attention and family expectations, Kennedy served as a young naval officer in the Pacific. It was here, amid darkness and uncertainty, that his understanding of leadership would deepen in ways no classroom could provide. In August 1943, Kennedy commanded a small patrol torpedo boat known as PT 109. One night, in the still waters of the Solomon Islands, the boat was struck and cut in half by a Japanese destroyer. The explosion was sudden, violent, and final. In seconds, command turned into survival. Flames lit the sea, and the quiet of the night dissolved into confusion and pain. Kennedy did not panic. Injured himself, he focused on others. He gathered his surviving crew, calmed them, and guided them through open water toward distant islands. For hours, and then days, he swam, towed wounded men, and rationed hope as carefully as food. There were no speeches, no witnesses, only persistence and responsibility in isolation. The experience reshaped him. Survival stripped leadership down to its simplest form. Care for others before oneself. There was no glory in those moments, only endurance and quiet resolve. Kennedy learned that authority meant action under pressure, and that courage often appears without ceremony. When rescue finally came, the world moved on quickly, but Kennedy did not forget. The PT 109 experience stayed with him, teaching him humility, patience, and calm crisis. Long before the Oval Office, war had already tested his character, shaping a leader who understood that true strength is revealed in silence, responsibility, and survival. From Congress to the White House. John F. Kennedy's journey from Congress to the White House was not sudden nor effortless. It unfolded slowly, shaped by discipline, patience, and a growing understanding of public responsibility. His early years in Congress were marked by observation more than spectacle. He listened carefully, learned institutional rhythms, and studied how power truly moved behind formal speeches and headline stuff. As a young congressman, Kennedy avoided loud gestures. Instead, he built credibility quietly, focusing on foreign policy, national security, and the emerging challenges of a divided world. He understood that modern leadership required intellect as much as charisma. While others sought attention, he refined judgment, aware that preparation mattered more than visibility. His move to the Senate expanded this perspective. There, Kennedy's voice grew steadier, his confidence more measured. He wrote, debated, and reflected, often using history as a guide rather than ideology alone. The pressures of public life did not harden him. The presidential campaign that followed was demanding and relentless. Youth became both an asset and a question mark. Kennedy faced skepticism about experience, faith, and readiness, yet his calm demeanor, thoughtful language, and ability to connect quietly with voters transformed doubt into trust. He spoke not with urgency, but with assurance. By the time he reached the White House, Kennedy carried more than ambition. He carried lessons learned in committee rooms, Senate debates, and private moments of reflection. The path from Congress to the presidency taught him that leadership is earned gradually, through listening, patience, and resolve. In the end, his rise was not defined by speed, but by steadiness. Each step prepared him for the wait ahead, shaping a president who understood that power, when approached carefully, must always serve something larger than oneself. The New Frontier and American Idealism. When John F. Kennedy spoke of the New Frontier, he was not describing a place on a map, but a state of mind. It was a quiet call to renewal, asking Americans to look forward rather than backward, to meet uncertainty with purpose instead of fear. In an era shaped by Cold War tension and rapid change, the New Frontier became a symbol of thoughtful progress. Kennedy's vision rested on idealism, but not illusion. He understood the limits of power and the cost of mistakes. Yet he believed that a nation's strength was measured not only by weapons or wealth, but by imagination, responsibility, and moral courage. The New Frontier asked citizens to serve, to question, and to participate in shaping the future together. This idealism extended into science, education, civil rights, and global responsibility. Kennedy encouraged Americans to see challenges as shared tasks rather than distant problems. His language was calm, measured, and forward-looking, designed to steady a nation living under the shadow of nuclear anxiety. Hope, he believed, must be disciplined to endure. The New Frontier was also personal. It reflected Kennedy's belief that leadership required empathy and restraint. He resisted grand promises, instead offering direction and trust in collective effort. The presidency, in his view, was not a stage for certainty, but a place for careful navigation through complexity. As time passed, the phrase took on a lasting meaning. It captured a moment when American idealism felt thoughtful rather than loud, reflective rather than forceful. Kennedy's New Frontier did not promise ease. It promised purpose in the quiet spaces between speeches and decisions. This vision endured. It reminded the nation that progress begins not with confidence alone, but with humility, shared responsibility, and the courage to imagine something better, even in uncertain times. A nation listening to a new voice. When John F. Kennedy became president, the nation did not simply watch him. It listened. His voice carried a tone unfamiliar to many Americans at the time. It was calm without being distant, confident without being loud. In a world crowded with fear and urgency, his words moved slowly, carefully, inviting reflection rather than reaction. Kennedy understood the power of language in a tense age. Television brought his speeches into living rooms, allowing Americans to see not only what he said, but how he said it. His pauses mattered. His restraint mattered. This new voice offered reassurance during uncertainty. The Cold War loomed, civil rights demands grew louder, and global responsibilities expanded. Kennedy did not promise easy solutions. Instead, he acknowledged complexity, asking citizens to share in responsibility rather than expect certainty. His words carried both challenge and calm. Listeners heard something different in him. Youth blended with seriousness, idealism mixed with caution. He appealed to reason and conscience more than fear. In doing so, he reshaped how Americans experience leadership, making it feel closer, more human, and more deliberate. In moments of tension, his voice became an anchor, reminding people that leadership was not about dominance but direction. He chose language that slowed the moment, allowing thought to replace impulse. As nights fell and radios played softly, the president's voice reached kitchens, bedrooms, and quiet corners of the country. For many, it became a sound associated with reassurance and reflection. A nation listened not because it was commanded to, but because it felt invited, In that listening, a new relationship between leader and people quietly formed, one built on trust, patience, and a belief that thoughtful words still mattered in shaping history. Cold War shadows over the Kennedy years. The presidency of John F. Kennedy unfolded beneath long and constant shadows. The Cold War was not a distant backdrop, but a presence that shaped every decision, every briefing, and every quiet moment of reflection. It was an age defined by invisible lines, opposing ideologies, and the fear that a single misstep could alter the fate of the world. Nuclear tension hung heavily over the Kennedy years. Maps, reports, and intelligence estimates arrived daily, reminding the administration that peace depended on restraint as much as strength. The threat was abstract yet deeply real, measured not in battles fought, but in wars narrowly avoided. The rivalry between superpowers influenced diplomacy, military planning, and public speech. Words had to be chosen carefully, actions even more so. Displays of confidence could not become provocations. Kennedy learned that power carried its own dangers, especially when paired with fear. Behind closed doors, discussions were cautious and deliberate. Advisors debated outcomes that could never be reversed. The young president listened closely, weighing not only national interest, but global consequence. He recognized that victory in the Cold War would not come through dominance alone, but through patience and control. For the public, the Cold War felt distant yet personal. Air raid drills, news broadcasts, and political tension seeped into everyday life. Kennedy's steady presence offered reassurance. Even as uncertainty persisted, he did not deny the danger. He acknowledged it quietly, choosing steadiness over alarm. As the years passed, these shadows remained constant companions to his presidency. They shaped his approach to crisis, diplomacy, and restraint. The Cold War defined the era, but Kennedy's response to it revealed a deeper lesson. The Bay of Pigs and lessons in failure. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a quiet but profound test of John F. Kennedy's presidency. What seemed at first like a calculated plan unfolded into a failure that would haunt the young president. In April 1961, a small force of Cuban exiles attempted to overthrow Fidel Castro, supported covertly by the United States. The mission, however, collapsed quickly, leaving Kennedy to confront the consequences of decisions he inherited and choices he had made. Failure arrived with both public scrutiny and private reflection. Kennedy faced criticism from allies, opponents, and a press. Yet behind the headlines, he absorbed the experience with patience and humility. The Bay of Pigs was a lesson in the limits of preparation, the unpredictability of action, and the weight of responsibility carried alone in the Oval Office. In the quiet hours following the fiasco, Kennedy examined every decision, every miscalculation. He learned that leadership requires acknowledging mistakes swiftly, accepting accountability, and recalibrating strategy with clarity and restraint. He realized that courage was not the absence of error, but the ability to respond thoughtfully when plans falter. The event also shaped his approach to the Cold War. Kennedy became more deliberate, more cautious, and more aware of the global stakes of American action. He strengthened channels of communication, sought diverse counsel, and measured every step with the knowledge that even small misjudgments could escalate dangerously. The Bay of Pigs left an enduring mark not as a symbol of shame, but as a quiet teacher. It revealed the costs of inexperience, the demands of responsibility, and the importance of reflection. Kennedy's response demonstrated resilience, patience, and the capacity to grow through failure. Lessons that would quietly shape the decisions that followed and define the trajectory of his presidency. Nuclear fear and the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world closer to destruction than almost any moment in history, and John F. Kennedy faced it with a quiet, disciplined resolve. In October 1962, American reconnaissance discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the U.S. coast. The discovery set in motion 13 tense days when every decision could determine the fate of millions, and Kennedy's calm approach became a nation's anchor. Behind the public announcements and press conferences, the president and his advisors worked tirelessly in the Oval Office. Intelligence reports, military options, and diplomatic possibilities were weighed with painstaking care. Kennedy understood the enormity of the crisis. One misstep could ignite global catastrophe. He moved slowly, listening to differing perspectives, evaluating consequences, and striving to choose the path that would prevent war while maintaining American credibility. The Cuban Missile Crisis revealed the power of restraint. Kennedy resisted immediate military action, choosing a naval blockade and back-channel negotiations instead. His strategy combined firmness with patience, demonstrating that leadership required both courage and self-control. While the world watched anxiously, he maintained calm, projecting confidence to reassure both Americans and allies abroad. Privately, Kennedy faced profound anxiety. Nights were long, and sleep was scarce, yet he remained steady. He modeled the Stoic principle that fear must be acknowledged, but not allowed to dictate action. In the end, diplomacy prevailed. Missiles were removed from Cuba, and the immediate threat of nuclear war receded. Kennedy's measured response became a defining moment, illustrating that the weight of leadership is often carried in silence, reflection, and the courage to choose restraint when the stakes are highest. Quiet diplomacy in a divided world. John F. Kennedy's presidency unfolded during a world sharply divided by ideology, yet he often relied not on force or spectacle, but on quiet diplomacy. In a time when tensions stretched across continents and nuclear threats loomed over every decision, Kennedy understood that careful words, subtle gestures, and private negotiations could prevent catastrophe as effectively as military might. The president met with allies and adversaries alike, seeking solutions behind closed doors. He balanced firmness with understanding, patience with urgency. Every conversation, every message, every signal was measured. Kennedy knew that public declarations could escalate conflicts, while private dialogue allowed flexibility and insight. His aim was not to dominate but to guide, to prevent misunderstandings, and to keep channels open even in the most dangerous circumstances. This approach extended to global crises and smaller disputes alike, from Cold War tensions in Berlin to negotiations over nuclear weapons. Kennedy relied on discretion, listening, and carefully considered strategies. He fostered trust quietly, often without recognition, understanding that the work of diplomacy is rarely visible but deeply consequential. Kennedy's method required restraint and observation. He weighed advice, considered history, and anticipated responses. Quiet diplomacy demanded humility as much as courage, the ability to act while remaining patient, and the foresight to know when to speak and when to hold silence. In a world defined by division, Kennedy's calm, deliberate approach demonstrated that leadership is not always in speeches or headlines, but in the quiet, deliberate choices that shape outcomes unseen. Through these efforts, he navigated crises with discretion and insight, leaving a legacy of thoughtful statesmanship that endures as a guide for leaders facing uncertain times. Civil rights and a moral test of leadership. John F. Kennedy's presidency was not only tested by global crises, but also by the moral challenges unfolding within his own nation. The civil rights movement was gaining strength, and the call for justice was no longer distant. It was urgent, visible, and impossible to ignore. Kennedy faced a nation divided, with deep-seated prejudice, fear, and resistance intertwined with progress, hope, and moral responsibility. In the quiet moments behind closed doors, he reflected on the principles that guided his leadership. Civil rights were not a political convenience, but a measure of the nation's character and his own. He recognized that moral courage required more than words. It demanded action, sometimes subtle, sometimes direct, and always deliberate. Kennedy approached this responsibility with careful thought. He worked with advisors, engaged with activists, and measured each step, knowing that abrupt action might provoke backlash, yet delay could perpetuate injustice. He sent federal marshals to protect those seeking education, address Congress with appeals for legislation, and use speeches to awaken the conscience of the nation. Leadership in this era required patience and resolve. Kennedy understood that social change is rarely immediate and that guiding a divided country demanded steadiness, empathy, and strategic timing. His decisions were not always bold in appearance, but they carried profound moral weight, demonstrating the quiet strength of principled leadership. Through these efforts, Kennedy's presidency was marked by a growing awareness that the measure of a leader lies not only in crisis management abroad, but in the courage to confront inequity at home. The civil rights movement became both a test and a defining lesson in moral responsibility, shaping the legacy of a president who sought justice with deliberation, patience, and quiet determination. Space, science, and the dream of the moon. John F. Kennedy's vision extended beyond politics and crisis. It reached into the heavens. In a time of tension on Earth, he inspired a nation to look skyward, to imagine possibilities beyond the immediate and the familiar. The space program, under his guidance, became a symbol of aspiration, innovation, and the quiet determination of a people daring to achieve what had once seemed impossible. Kennedy understood that the pursuit of space exploration required patience, discipline, and long-term commitment. It was not a spectacle to be rushed, but a journey of careful planning, technological mastery, and intellectual courage. The goal of reaching the moon was ambitious, but he framed it as a shared endeavor, asking the nation to contribute effort, thought, and belief in human potential. In speeches and private counsel, Kennedy emphasized the significance of science and research. The space race was more than national prestige. It represented progress, problem solving, and the expansion of knowledge. Every experiment, launch, and challenge became a lesson in persistence. Failure was expected, yet was met with analysis, recalibration, and renewed effort. The dream of the moon also reflected a broader philosophy. Kennedy encouraged citizens to embrace curiosity, to value education, and to imagine beyond immediate boundaries. The moon became a metaphor for human courage, ingenuity, and the power of collective aspiration. Through calm leadership, Kennedy guided the nation into a new frontier of exploration, blending politics, science, and imagination. The moon was distant, yet within reach, not only as a destination in space, but as a symbol of what disciplined vision, quiet determination, and thoughtful leadership can achieve. His words and actions left a lasting impression, reminding the world that progress begins with curiosity and a steady, patient commitment to the unknown. Words that moved a generation. John F. Kennedy understood that leadership was not only measured by actions, but by words carefully chosen to inspire, reassure, and guide. In a time of global tension, social change, and uncertainty, his speeches became more than statements. They became quiet instruments of reflection and purpose, moving a generation with calm clarity rather than forceful command. From his inaugural address to lesser-known remarks, Kennedy's language carried a rhythm that invited thought. He spoke of service, responsibility, and hope, reminding citizens that the strength of a nation lies not only in power, but in character. His words were measured, deliberate, and accessible, offering both comfort and challenge without overwhelming the listener. Kennedy's speeches often blended idealism with pragmatism. He acknowledged the difficulties of the era, from the Cold War to civil rights struggles, but framed them as opportunities for collective effort. In this way, his words encouraged reflection, urging Americans to consider their role in shaping the future while remaining grounded in reality. Behind each speech lay preparation, research, and quiet rehearsal. Kennedy understood that language could calm fear, foster unity, and inspire courage. His delivery, often gentle yet deliberate, conveyed confidence without arrogance and hope without naivety. the impact of these words extended beyond immediate politics. They reached classrooms, homes, and communities, shaping attitudes and aspiration for years to come. Kennedy's voice, calm and thoughtful, demonstrated that true influence often flows not from decree, but from words that resonate, guide, and endured. Through his speeches, John F. Kennedy moved a generation with measured insight, illustrating that the quiet power of language can shape history, touch hearts, and guide nations toward reflection, action, and collective purpose. Power, pressure, and private doubts. The presidency of John F. Kennedy was a balance between public expectation and private reflection. From the moment he assumed office, he bore the weight of power, a responsibility that demanded careful thought, decisive action, and a constant awareness of consequences that stretched across the globe. Yet beneath the public image of confidence and charisma lay private doubts that few ever glimpsed at. Every decision carried pressure. The Cold War, civil rights, and the demands of a nation looking toward progress created a constant, unrelenting tension. Kennedy faced choices with lives, reputations, and history at stake, often wrestling internally over the best course of action. He knew that boldness without caution could lead to catastrophe, and restraint without courage could invite criticism. In quiet moments, Kennedy reflected on the weight he carried. The presidency was not only about policy or strategy, but about character and judgment. He understood that fear, uncertainty, and doubt were natural companions to leadership, and that acknowledging them did not weaken authority, but allowed for measured, deliberate decision-making. Kennedy relied on careful counsel, debate, and thoughtful observation. He absorbed conflicting perspectives, weighed consequences, and measured the timing of every action. The private doubts he carried were not indecision, but a form of quiet discipline, ensuring that each choice was informed, ethical, and responsible. Despite pressure and internal questioning, Kennedy projected steadiness. His public persona remained calm, reassuring, and composed, masking the complexities beneath. In this balance between power, pressure, and private doubt, he revealed that leadership is as much about inner reflection as public action, and that the true measure of a president lies in the ability to navigate uncertainty with both humility and resolve. Leadership in an age of uncertainty. John F. Kennedy assumed the presidency during one of the most uncertain periods in modern history. The world was marked by tension, ideological conflict, and the ever-present threat of nuclear confrontation. At home, social change, civil rights struggles, and political divisions tested the nation's resilience. In this climate, Kennedy's leadership was defined not by bold declarations alone, but by calm deliberation and thoughtful guidance. He understood that uncertainty demanded more than authority. It required reflection, foresight, and patience. Every decision, from foreign policy to domestic initiatives, carried consequences that could ripple across decades. Kennedy approached these challenges with a quiet awareness that leadership is measured not by appearances, but by the ability to act wisely under pressure. The young president relied on counsel, history, and careful analysis. He listened to experts, considered alternatives, and weighed outcomes with precision. Yet he also recognized that leadership was personal. The weight of responsibility, the moral obligation to protect life, and the duty to maintain national stability rested ultimately on him. In an age of unpredictability, Kennedy balanced courage with caution. He projected confidence to inspire trust, while internally measuring every step to avoid irreversible error. Crisis management, diplomacy, and domestic policy were guided by this principle. Steadiness amidst turbulence is a quiet but profound form of power. Through calm speeches, measured actions, and careful reflection, Kennedy modeled leadership that embraced uncertainty without fear. This example demonstrated that even in the most unstable times, thoughtful guidance, moral clarity, and patient judgment can steer a nation through its most challenging moments. Leadership in this era was as much about restraint and reflection as it was about decisive action. The presidency as performance and burden. For John F. Kennedy, the presidency was both a stage and a weight to bear. Publicly, he was expected to embody energy, charisma, and confidence, the image of a young leader capable of inspiring a nation. Behind the cameras and speeches, however, the reality of leadership was far quieter, heavier, and often isolating. The office demanded constant vigilance, careful judgment, and the ability to carry responsibility for millions of lives while maintaining composure. Every decision felt amplified. International crises, domestic unrest, and global expectations combined into a constant, unrelenting pressure. Kennedy understood that perception mattered nearly as much as action. How a leader appeared could reassure allies, deter adversaries, and instill calm among citizens. Yet he also recognized that the true work of leadership often went unseen. Quiet deliberation, private consultation, and the steady absorption of weighty knowledge. The duality of performance and burden shaped Kennedy's days. Public appearances required optimism and eloquence, while private hours were spent analyzing intelligence, drafting policy, and contemplating consequences. Kennedy carried this burden with measured grace. Even as the world watched, he maintained calm, thoughtful composure. The performance was necessary, but it never replaced reflection, empathy, or careful decision-making. In this tension between outward projection and inward responsibility, the young president demonstrated that leadership is both visible and invisible, celebratory and solemn, inspiring and quietly exacting. Through it all, Kennedy revealed that the weight of the presidency is carried not by spectacle alone, but by patience, moral clarity, and a resilience to sustain both image and responsibility in equal measure. Media, image, and a rise of television politics. John F. Kennedy's presidency coincided with the rise of television as a dominant force in politics, transforming how leaders connected with citizens. Unlike previous generations, Kennedy's words, gestures, and expressions could be seen in living rooms across the nation. Television did not just report his presidency, it shaped it, requiring a careful balance between image and substance, presence and preparation. Kennedy understood the medium's power. He presented confidence, calm, and eloquence, knowing that viewers absorbed more than content. They absorbed tone, demeanor, and composure. Debates, addresses, and press conferences became performances, not in the sense of artifice, but as tools for leadership, conveying reassurance and vision in a time of uncertainty. Yet television also magnified every misstep, every hesitation, and every nuance of expression. Kennedy was aware that public perception could influence policy, diplomacy, and a national mood. He cultivated a careful rhythm in speech, a deliberate tone in delivery, and an approachable presence that bridged the gap between the White House and ordinary citizens. Behind the scenes, the work remained disciplined and reflective. Television was a tool, not a substitute, for judgment and deliberation. Kennedy's reliance on media strategy was balanced by private study, thoughtful counsel, and measured decision-making. He treated the camera not as an adversary, but as a channel to extend careful leadership into the homes of millions. In this new era, Kennedy demonstrated that image and substance could coexist. Television shaped expectations, but could also amplify responsibility, empathy, and vision. Through calm engagement with media, he transformed politics into a dialogue of both appearance and action, teaching a generation that leadership must be communicated with clarity, poise, and quiet intention. Allies, rivals, and global responsibility. John F. Kennedy's presidency existed in a world defined by alliances, rivalries, and the delicate balance of global responsibility. From Europe to Asia, from the Caribbean to the Pacific, every decision carried international weight, and every action was observed by friends and adversaries alike. Leadership, Kennedy learned, extended far beyond the Oval Office. It was measured by the steadiness with which a nation navigated a complex, interconnected world. He understood that allies demanded reassurance and trust, and that rivals sought weakness to exploit. Kennedy approached both with careful calculation. Diplomacy was quiet yet deliberate, a series of small but meaningful gestures designed to maintain balance, prevent escalation, and build confidence. Every phone call, letter, and meeting carried significance far beyond the immediate moment. The young president carried the awareness that global responsibility was inseparable from moral obligation. Decisions regarding defense, economic aid, and foreign policy required foresight, patience, and restraint. He weighed the human cost of action alongside strategic necessity, recognizing that leadership demanded both intellect and empathy. Kennedy also balanced firmness with dialogue. He projected authority without arrogance and practiced restraint even under intense pressure. His approach demonstrated that true influence is rarely loud or impulsive. It is quiet, measured, and guided by principle. Through careful engagement with allies and rivals alike, Kennedy shaped a presidency defined by responsibility, reflection, and the understanding that global leadership requires calm judgment. In a divided and uncertain world, he showed that steady guidance, moral clarity, and strategic patience could maintain stability while quietly advancing national and human interests. A short presidency with lasting impact. John F. Kennedy's time in office was brief, yet its influence endures far beyond the 3 years he held the presidency. In that short span, he faced some of the most daunting challenges of the 20th century: global tension, civil rights struggles, and the dawn of the space age, each demanding wisdom, courage, and careful reflection. Despite the brevity of his tenure, the decisions he made, and the example he set left a quiet but profound imprint on history. Kennedy's leadership was defined by a combination of idealism and pragmatism. He inspired a nation to envision progress, yet he tempered hope with deliberation, understanding that meaningful change is rarely immediate. His calm, thoughtful approach to crisis, diplomacy, and domestic reform became a model for measured action under pressure, showing that effectiveness is not always loud or dramatic. Even as his presidency was cut short, the policies, initiatives, and principles he established continued to influence subsequent leaders. The space program, civil rights legislation, and approaches to Cold War diplomacy reflected his vision, patience, and moral clarity. Kennedy demonstrated that the weight of leadership can be carried with quiet strength, shaping the trajectory of a nation through both words and deeds. The brevity of his tenure also emphasized the fragility of life and leadership, reminding the world that influence is not measured solely by time, but by the thoughtfulness, courage, and integrity with which power is exercised. Kennedy's presidency remains a study in how determination, vision, and disciplined reflection can leave enduring marks even in a fleeting span. Through calm deliberation, principled action, and inspiring vision, John F. Kennedy's short presidency continues to resonate, proving that true impact is achieved not merely through duration, but through the depth and care with which leadership is exercised. Dallas and a nation in shock. On November 22, 1963, the nation awoke to a reality that seemed impossible. John F. Kennedy, the young president who had inspired hope and embodied a vision for progress, was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. The streets that had welcomed his motorcade became the scene of sudden tragedy, and a nation collectively shuddered in disbelief and grief. The shock was immediate and profound. Families gathered around radios and televisions, watching the unthinkable unfold in real time. Questions multiplied, fear and sorrow mingled, and the careful optimism that Kennedy had cultivated across his presidency seemed to shatter in an instant. Dallas became a symbol of loss, and the abrupt end of his leadership reminded the country of life's fragility, even for those who seemed larger than it. Amid the public grief, the private reality was also stark. Staff, advisors, and family were left to navigate chaos and sorrow, while honoring the weight of responsibility left behind. The nation mourned not only a leader, but the unfulfilled potential of his vision, the dreams of civil rights progress, global cooperation, and the pursuit of knowledge and innovation. Dallas marked a turning point in history, a moment when the optimism of the early 1960s met the stark reality of mortality and political vulnerability. Kennedy's legacy, however, was not erased by tragedy. Instead, it was crystallized in memory and action, inspiring reflection on leadership, courage, and the delicate balance between hope and uncertainty. In the quiet aftermath, as the nation absorbed the shock, Kennedy's ideals endured. His life, in sudden death, taught that leadership leaves lasting impressions, that the impact of vision transcends time, and that even in loss, the work of a thoughtful, courageous president continues to shape the collective conscience of a country. Mourning, memory, and myth. The assassination of John F. Kennedy left the nation in a state of profound mourning. Grief swept across cities, towns, and homes, uniting Americans in sorrow and reflection. The loss of a young president whose charisma and vision had inspired hope created an emptiness that was both personal and collective, a quiet pause in the rhythm of a nation suddenly aware of its fragility. Memory became a refuge. Kennedy's words, gestures, and ideals were replayed in homes, classrooms, and offices. People clung to speeches that had inspired courage, to images that conveyed calm determination, and to moments of leadership that symbolized possibility. The careful, measured way he had led the nation became a standard by which citizens and historians alike began to judge both leaders and themselves. In time, myth intertwined with memory. Kennedy was elevated to a symbol of youth, optimism, and moral clarity. The narrative of his presidency merged reality with aspiration, creating a quiet legend that emphasized courage, vision, and dedication over the everyday complexities and compromises of leadership. His image, preserved in photographs, recordings, and recollections, became timeless, reaching beyond the era he had lived in. Yet the myth never erased the man. Beneath the public figure was a leader who navigated immense pressure, uncertainty, and responsibility with reflection and calm. Mourning and memory honored both his humanity and his accomplishments, while myth ensured that his influence extended into generations who had never witnessed his presidency firsthand. Through grief, remembrance, and the quiet shaping of legend, Kennedy's life became more than history. It became a touchstone for leadership, vision, and possibility, a reminder that even brief lives can leave enduring impressions that inspire thought, reflection, and aspiration. The Kennedy legacy in American history. John F. Kennedy's presidency, though brief, left a lasting imprint on American history. His leadership unfolded during a time of rapid change, global tension, and social transformation, yet his approach combined careful reflection with inspiring vision. The legacy he left behind was not measured only in legislation or policy, but in the ideals he embodied, the questions he raised, and the example he set for future generations. Kennedy inspired Americans to imagine a more engaged and responsible citizenry. He emphasized public service, civic responsibility, and the importance of participating in shaping the nation's future. The call to ask now what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country reflected a belief in collective action and moral duty that resonated quietly but profoundly across society. On the world stage, Kennedy's legacy is found in diplomacy, measured responses to crises, and the understanding that leadership requires both courage and restraint. From the Cuban Missile Crisis to advancing space exploration, he demonstrated that thoughtful planning, patience, and moral clarity could achieve progress without unnecessary confrontation. The Kennedy legacy also lives in American culture and memory. He became a symbol of hope, resilience, and youthful energy. Civil rights, scientific advancement, and engagement in global affairs were shaped by his example, and his life continues to encourage reflection on the responsibilities of leadership. Even decades later, Kennedy's presidency remains a reference point, not only for what was accomplished, but for the quiet values he embodied: intellect, empathy, patience, and vision. His legacy reminds the nation that leadership is not only about power, but about purpose, and that even a short tenure can leave enduring lessons in history. What JFK represents to the modern world. John F. Kennedy represents more than a presidency. He embodies an enduring idea of leadership in the modern world. His life, vision, and actions continue to resonate, not because of longevity in office, but because of the principles he demonstrated: courage under pressure, reflection in decision-making, and the ability to inspire collective purpose. Kennedy's influence stretches beyond American borders. In a world marked by ideological conflict, social upheaval, and rapid technological change, his approach to leadership, calm, deliberate, and visionary, offers lessons in measured action. He showed that progress is achieved not only through power, but through careful thought, empathy, and moral clarity, qualities that remain relevant in today's complex global landscape. Through speeches, initiatives, and crises, Kennedy exemplified the potential of ideas to transcend circumstance. The space program, civil rights advocacy, and diplomatic strategies reflected a forward-looking perspective, emphasizing possibility and responsibility. His words, carefully chosen, encouraged nations and citizens alike to engage with hope, purpose, and shared effort. At the same time, JFK represents the fragility and intensity of leadership. The suddenness of his death reminds the world that influence is not guaranteed by time, but by the impact of choices, vision, and integrity. He remains a symbol of the quiet power of deliberate action, moral courage, and intellectual engagement. In the modern world, Kennedy stands as a reminder that leadership is not only about authority, but about ideals and the ability to inspire thoughtful action. His life continues to guide reflection, shaping how leaders, citizens, and nations approach challenges, opportunities, and the enduring responsibility to make the future better. Epilogue on hope, loss, and unfinished promise. John F. Kennedy's life and presidency are a story of hope intertwined with loss, of vision met with sudden interruption, and of promises left unfinished yet enduring. His tenure, brief as it was, inspired a generation to imagine a nation capable of progress, courage, and moral leadership. Yet the suddenness of his death reminded the world that even the brightest ambitions are vulnerable to fate. Hope was central to Kennedy's impact. From calls to public service to the dream of space exploration, he encouraged citizens to believe in possibility, to embrace responsibility, and to strive for collective improvement. His speeches, carefully measured, communicated optimism without naivety, urging engagement and reflection in an age of uncertainty. Loss accompanied that hope. The assassination in Dallas brought grief that was national and deeply personal, leaving a sense of incompleteness. Projects, initiatives, and visions he had begun remained in progress, dependent on the perseverance of others to carry them forward. The contrast between potential and abrupt absence highlighted the fragile intersection of leadership, circumstance, and history. Yet the unfinished promise of Kennedy's presidency did not diminish its influence. His ideals, approach to crisis, and measured, reflective leadership continue to inspire thought, debate, and aspiration. He remains a touchstone for moral clarity, courageous decision-making, and the quiet strength of vision. In this epilogue, the story of John F. Kennedy reminds us that leadership is never merely about years served. It is about the hope a leader plants, the lessons left behind, and the enduring influence of character and purpose, even in a life and presidency cut tragically short. His legacy continues, quiet but powerful, shaping the way we understand possibility, responsibility, and the promise of tomorrow. For more powerful stories from history, subscribe to Legacy by Mao. Your support truly matters.